You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am now absolutely delighted to be joined here in the studio by Gershon Baskin, a veteran peace activist, the chairman of the board of IPCRI, the Israel-Palestine Creative Regional Initiatives, and author of the recently published The Negotiator, Freeing Gilad Schalit from Hamas, was published a couple of months ago in English by Toby Press. Good evening, Gershon. Welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Good evening.
This book is a personal account of your personal involvement in the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Schalit a bit over 2 years ago. In a prisoner exchange deal that followed more than 5 years of him being in captivity by Hamas, the Islamist group that now rules the Gaza Strip. Now, I'm going to ask you to shed your modesty for a moment. Our listeners still haven't heard you, but I can attest to your modesty. How instrumental were you in clinching this deal? Would it have materialized without your mediation?
Probably not. Something that most people don't know is that if Gilad Schalit had been in captivity for another month, he probably would have died.
Really? Why is that?
Severe malnutrition, not for lack of food. Gilad suffered from acute lack of vitamin D from being exposed to sunlight once in 5 years and 4 months. The acute lack of vitamin D created loss of appetite. And his 6 last weeks in captivity, he basically couldn't hold food down. He couldn't eat. He had no appetite. What they forced him to eat, he couldn't digest, and he would have died another month.
Was it something that was out in the open?
No, it hasn't really been talked about. When he did cross the border after that horrendous Egyptian interview that he went through, he actually physically collapsed. And they had to give him intravenous and adrenaline. He was not in good physical shape mostly for malnutrition. Yeah. He had been kept well. He wasn't really abused. There was no contact between Israel and the Hamas through third parties or through anyone else for more than a year. There was a German mediator who finished his work in December 2009. He was basically thrown off the case by Ahmed Jabari, the head of the Ezzedin al-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas. He was told not to come back. From December 2009 until May 2011, there were no negotiations going on at all between Israel and Hamas.
And even the negotiations that were going on before then, it seemed like every time they tried to restart them, they were hitting a dead end.
There was this German mediator who had successfully negotiated the deal between Israel and Hezbollah to bring back the 2 soldiers who had been killed, Eldad Regev and Udi Goldwasser.
In 2000.
In 2000 and...
No, sorry, 2006?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, just before, a couple of months after Gilad Schalit was abducted, right?
Well, they were kidnapped July 12th. Gilad was on June 25th in 2006. But the deal was concluded in 2008, if I recall. So the German mediator was asked by Israel, and Hamas agreed to step in. And he actually went back and forth between Gaza and Israel and Cairo more than 50 times and worked out a deal that when it became clear to Netanyahu that Hamas was not going to accept it, Netanyahu announced that Israel was willing to accept it. Even though I don't think he really was. But and then the Israeli policy became, we're waiting for an answer for Hamas. And even after the German mediator left and nothing was going on, the Israeli response remained, we're waiting for a response for Hamas. In July of 2010, a full year, more than a year before Gilad came back, I was approached by Hamas with a document that was sent to me from Ahmed Jabari that offered to renew the negotiations on the basis of the work that the German mediator had done. And the Israeli establishment, from the prime minister down, refused to engage.
Yeah. Why did they turn to Gershon Baskin?
They didn't turn to Gershon Baskin. Throughout the 5 years and 4 months that Gilad was in captivity, I nudged them. I pestered them. I had a contact.
And the Israeli government as well.
No, it was I'm talking about the Israeli government. I was approached by Hamas 6 days after Gilad was abducted. I had met a professor of economics from the Islamic University of Gaza in Cairo in several months before Gilad was abducted. We tried to create a kind of academic dialogue between Hamas people and Israeli academics. We were going to do it abroad. I found 4 countries that were willing to sponsor it. But then the Hamas leadership vetoed it. In the interim, this relationship between myself and this professor at the Islamic University had developed. I'd visited him in Gaza. We went together to the Hamas Prime Minister's office to try and convince the leadership to okay the dialogue. Anyway, when Gilad was abducted, Israel went in a military operation in Gaza and bombed Gaza pretty severely, including cutting out the electrical network and water network. And 6 days after Gilad was abducted on July 1st, 2006, this professor called me and said, Gershon, we have to do something. I said to him, what can we do? He said, let's try to open up a channel of communication. He went to Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas Prime Minister's office. I got a phone call from them half an hour later. And that it started my involvement. And I just wouldn't let go. Throughout that period of time, kept reminding the Israeli establishment, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the people directly involved in the case, that there was an opportunity for a direct, secret back channel that I believed from the outset was the best way to make a deal.
Did you never think that you were duped by Hamas? And more importantly,
there were times.
Did the government not think that you were just an innocent, bleeding heart left here trying to sell them dreams?
The government people knew me quite well. Omrit knew me quite well, and although we did not agree politically at that time when Omrit was still very right-wing, the messages that I was transmitting to him were going through his daughter. And they have the ability to check the validity of the messages that I was transmitting to them. It was clear that Olmert was not ready to engage. Olmert was not ready to make a deal, particularly at the end of his political career, when he was already under the shadow or the clouds of being indicted for corruption. He didn't want to leave office with a massive release of Palestinian prisoners, even though he's the one who agreed to the terms of the deal. Olmert, in December 2006, agreed that Gilad Schalit would be exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners.
It was just a question of deciding who they are.
Right. He's the one who made the deal. He had no intention, in my view, of ever fulfilling the deal. But the price was set at that point, and Hamas never agreed to go below that price once it had been agreed to.
But then they said that when the deal was actually finally struck in 2011, a fair few years afterwards, they said that Hamas backed away from its initial demands.
No, Hamas never backed away from its initial demands. What did change? What did change over time was the list of names. Hamas had. And this was my involvement in the negotiations that I carried on, which became official in May of 2011, authorized by the Prime Minister. It was convincing Hamas to remove some of the names that Israel absolutely refused to have on the list, and then finding ways to mitigate what the security establishment in Israel thought was too risky in terms of releasing too many prisoners who were considered dangerous or potentially dangerous into the territory. So Hamas eventually agreed. There was a list of 50 names that were the most dangerous prisoners. Hamas eventually agreed that there would be only 25 of them released out of the 50, that Israel would select the 25, and that all 25 of them would be deported.
But wouldn't you agree that it's a major concession?
I think it was a major concession. It developed over a period of several months of the negotiations that I was directly involved in. And it basically came down to a proposal that I made to my Hamas counterpart, who was Ghazi Hamad, who is today the deputy foreign minister of Hamas. We had been ping-ponging back and forth over and over again over the categories and the numbers. And I proposed to him at a certain point, look, you know your side's red lines. I know Netanyahu's red lines. Let's agree that you and I are going to open our cards. We're going to put our cards on the table, and we'll agree now, before we do that we're going to hit the middle point. Whatever the middle point is between your red lines and our lines, that's what I'm going to propose to the Israeli side and get them to accept. And that's basically what we did.
Why weren't you officially appointed as the government envoy to?
Well,
to
eventually I did receive an official appointment. I have a letter that was given to me by David Meidan.
Yeah, but we had Chagai Adas and David Meidan and people.
It's hard for these security folks. It's hard for the establishments to take in an outsider. I'm not from the system. I'm not from the security establishment. They don't have control of me. I wasn't on salary. I didn't receive money from anyone to do that. I'm a free agent So they don't like that. It's hard for them to deal with.
Going back to what you said initially, that there was a significant threat to Gilad Shalit's life. It seems like Israel should have been far more desperate to get him released before.
There were, I think, the main thrust of the establishment was to not negotiate a deal and to find a military solution to bring him home. Certainly at the beginning, before Kastled, they, from the information I know, they knew where he was. There was at least one military operation that went out to try and bring him back. Another one was planned and was never implemented. After Kastled, they lost touch of him. They didn't know where he was.
He was moved to another location.
He was moved 3 or 4 times during the 5 years and 4 months. It was actually in 3 different main locations. From time to time, he would be moved in the middle of the night, also from one place to another, probably when Hamas suspected that there was troop movement or something on the Israeli side. But I think that most of the time there was the hope from the military that they would be able to, go in and do an Entebbe, go in and with tweezers pull him out, rescue him and save him in a heroic mission. And the truth is, if they could have done that, that would have been the best.
Yeah.
But they couldn't.
Yeah. Were you in touch with the Shalit family? Or
yeah. I was in touch very intensively at the beginning. On that first day in July 1st, 2006, I arranged a phone call between Noam Shalit and one of the Hamas leaders. 2.5 months later, I brought the first sign of life from Gilad, a handwritten letter. I went to Gaza to arrange for that to happen. I was in touch with the Shalits throughout that period. As the formal establishment took over, it was 50 days after he was abducted that someone was appointed by the Prime Minister, Ofer Dekel, the former deputy head of the Shin Bet, who was appointed. The first 50 days, there was no one in charge of the case. And then afterwards, the officials in the security establishment, the Shin Bet and Mossad, kept telling the Shalit family that they should not have contact with me. So there were ups and downs.
Why?
Because they don't like someone like me who's not controllable. They don't have control. I'm not, I'm not a subordinate. They can't give me an order.
But still, you didn't let go. This is some,
I didn't let go. The part of the
story
story
talk about it now. You seem so emotionally invested in this, as if Gilad was someone that you knew at the time, but you hadn't really met him before.
I never met him before. I didn't know the Shalit family. It was not really relevant, even though Gilad became part of our family, like he did become part of the family of Jews all around the world. At dinner tables, at holiday tables, there was a seat for Gilad Shalit. Gilad Shalit was forever present in my house during that period when he was abducted, but it really starts a year before he was abducted. Because a year before Gilad was abducted in September of 2005, a first cousin of my wife's was abducted, kidnapped, and killed by Hamas. And during the time
in the West Bank.
In the West Bank. And during the time that he was missing, the family had asked me to use all my connections with the Palestinians to try and find him. And I failed. Right? I couldn't. I didn't produce results, and my wife's cousin was killed. And at his funeral, I swore to myself that, standing over his grave, that if ever again I had an opportunity, someone came to me and said, help, in a similar situation, I would do everything humanly possible. I was not willing to let go. Every day I thought about Gilad Shalit. I would go to sleep at night thinking about Gilad Shalit. I would wake up in the middle of the night and think of who else I could turn to, who else I could enlist, how I could get. And I knew all the time, as my connections to the people in Gaza were developing, connections to the Hamas leadership, that I had the ability, both through my more than 2 decades of experience of working closely with Palestinians, that I had the ability to develop a relationship with people on the Hamas side that could produce results. I was getting messages all the time from the people I was talking to. Although they refused to admit that they would ever do a direct contact with an Israeli, they talked to me because I was not an official.
Exactly.
They rejected the idea of a direct back channel. I knew that if Israel had agreed to a direct secret back channel, so would they. And it had to be secret because both sides needed the deniability, because they both refused to recognize the other's existence. So you need a secret kind of channel, which each side can say doesn't exist.
Do you think that there could be any spillover from that really pragmatic negotiation to something that resembles reconciliation?
There has been repeatedly spillovers in terms of day-to-day life. Throughout the period when I was involved in negotiating ceasefires when it was needed, I was directly involved in them. to humanitarian issues, to now helping deal with issues of electricity and water for Gaza, to just this week, I was sitting in the American Colony Hotel 2 days ago with David Meidan, who he's now not in the Mossad anymore, but he was the Mossad officer who Netanyahu appointed, who finally engaged me. I was sitting with David Meidan in the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem. We were having a conversation, and I received a phone call from Razi Hamad in Gaza, who asked me to deliver a message to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, which I did.
Let's go back to that day.
But I want to be clear. In terms of negotiating a peace deal with Hamas, that's not on the table at all. And in my estimation, won't be on the table. We have a Palestinian partner, and that's Mahmoud Abbas, who's in Ramallah.
Okay. Going back to that day that you realized that the deal was going to happen, can you tell me a bit about your emotions?
Well, there were a few days like that. Already in May, when David Meidan received a green light from Netanyahu to run the secret back channel, I met with him and told him that in my view, failure is not an option. We're bringing Gilad home. I came home and said those very words to my wife. We're bringing Gilad home. We're going to do this. By mid-July, July 14th, we had received, I received the seventh version of the document that we were negotiating on the principles for the prisoner exchange. And David Meidan called me and said, this is it. This is the breakthrough document. I didn't identify it as a breakthrough document. I didn't know at what point the Israelis would say, this is where we got to. This is good for us. David Meidan received that document on July 14th in the morning, called me up and said, this is it. I'm taking it to Netanyahu. Later that day, he took it to Netanyahu and he got a green light to complete the deal. So I knew then that it was going to happen.
Do you think that same deal could have been reached before without risking Gilad's life, or
I think it could have been reached 4.5 years before.
The same deal.
The same deal.
Yeah. So it was just a lack of communication or lack of seriousness?
Well, as I said, I don't think that Olmert was prepared to make the deal at all. The new Prime Minister, Netanyahu, when he came into office, was not going to make this his first order of business coming into office. And it wasn't until the story goes, as I know it, Pesach, Passover time, the Schalit families in front of the Prime Minister's house holding their Seder in the street. It was a pretty miserable affair. My family and I came to visit them before Passover began. It was really, really sad. And apparently during Pesach, Sarah Netanyahu, the wife of the Prime Minister, turned to the Prime Minister and said, it's time to bring him home.
Okay. This is really a touching story, Gershon Baskin. I really encourage our listeners to get your book, The Negotiators Freeing Gilad Schalit from Hamas, published a couple of months ago in English by Toby Press. Gershon Baskin, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you.